This is the final review, Anita.
What?
Okay, everybody. Yeah, welcome back to class again with Chaplain's College, Old Testament Survey 3, looking at the books of the writings. This is lesson 7, despite what some people were trying to tell some people here. We'll be looking at Ezra and Nehemiah. Quick look at our lesson outline. This is the last teaching session for this class. I think Paul has one more teaching session next week, and probably will do his review like at the end of that. But if I was looking at his schedule, it looks like he has a teaching session scheduled for next week also. So at least for this class, this is the last teaching session. And next week will be the review. And I don't know if any of you had a chance to look at the lesson 6 online thing that finally got posted, but I had a little kind of a scenario for you guys to work on. So probably, since the review usually doesn't take up the whole amount of time, next week we'll probably talk a little bit about our little role-playing thing that I talked about in lesson 6, and just see what you guys came up with as you did that.
Let's go listen to lesson 6. You didn't post. You just posted it today, right?
Right.
Okay, because okay.
Yeah, went up this morning. Lesson 6 went up this morning. Okay, so let's get right into Ezra and Nehemiah. Okay, lesson 6 was on the 1st and 2nd Chronicles. So, as with the 1st and 2nd Chronicles, this was Ezra and Nehemiah were originally one book altogether. Just kind of continued on, and then it's still one book in the Hebrew Bible. Was written during the time of the return by Ezra, who also wrote the 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Ezra was both a priest and a scribe. And the themes we'll be looking at are rebuilding the temple and the walls of Jerusalem, and the revival of the people. And by the revival of the people, it's kind of a couple ways of looking at things here. It's getting them cranked up and getting over their depression so that they can actually rebuild the city. And there's also a spiritual revival that takes place during this time. Okay, cooking a little bit of a look at the background as we're looking at this. When we talk about the return, there are actually 3 different waves of the return. The first wave was led by Zerubbabel at 538 BC. Second wave was led by Ezra in 458 BC. And then the third wave return from the captivity was Nehemiah in 445 BC. And one thing I kind of notice here is
the dates are weird. If the first wave was 538,
you're counting down to 0. It goes
backwards.
Yeah, you go backwards. So as you get
Okay. Oh, I'm
Yeah.
sorry.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
yeah, we're still BC here.
Thank you.
But yeah, I noticed if you look at we have these 3 waves of return, but there were also 3 waves of deportation when they first came in and started taking them off to Babylon. So it's kind of interesting that you see the kind of the symmetry of this here, that 3 deportations, 3 returns. And actually, as I was thinking about this and noticing that symmetry, it got me to think about the way that Jesus handled Peter right after he denied 3 times. And when they were together at the lake and they'd gone out fishing, and then Jesus asked him 3 times, "Do you love me?" So kind of somewhere there's something about symmetry that God seems to like. Not quite sure what it is, but you find it in more than one spot. So something about it. Anyhow, during this time, of course, they're still under the rule of Persia via the local governors. The Davidic line of kingship has not been restored. So they're still actually under Persian rule at this point. But
Which means King Cyrus, right?
Cyrus and then Artaxerxes and whatever, and then it continues on later, the Greeks conquer the Persians and then the Romans conquer the Greeks, and so they all end up appointing governors at various times, but that's usually the Greeks and the Romans were after the Old Testament period. Anyhow, but one of the important things that we find here is that the priestly line was reestablished in Jerusalem. Started off when Joshua came back with Zerubbabel and a bunch of other priests and Levites in that first wave, and their task was to rebuild the temple. And then Ezra himself was a priest, so he came back during this time. So we are getting the priestly line reestablished. We'll be looking at that a little bit more detail here in just a bit. But
Tom, what does that actually mean? What is that?
if you go way back, into the books of the law, and it said, only somebody that descended, from Levi, and then only then from Aaron can be serving as a priest, and only the high priest is the one that's allowed to actually go into the Holy of Holies. So they're reestablishing that line. One of the things you notice that there's a lot of genealogies in these last 4 books that we're looking at, and that's really just to establish their capability and give them their credentials basically for doing the jobs they're doing. Because you had all the Levites that were doing temple work, but only certain ones were allowed to be priests. So they were establishing that.
So Ezra was in that priestly line, or
Yes.
Joshua?
Yeah, Joshua, don't see a whole lot about him directly, but it does mention that he was a priest and that was, of the right line and all that. That he came back in that first wave with Zerubbabel when they actually were rebuilding the temple. Now, they didn't rebuild it anywhere near as grand as it was, but they did get it rebuilt eventually. So looking at the book of Ezra, starts off with basically he establishes his credentials. So he just traces his line back, to Levi, and more pointedly to Aaron. He also makes a point in there for Zadok. I think that's because at one point in time, because of some of the priests weren't doing what they were supposed to, and only those that were sons of Zadok were doing the right thing, that then it was saying, okay, only now it's only those descended from Zadok can be priests. So I think that's why he made sure that he had Zadok in there too, because he was following that line. In addition to having his priestly credentials, he also was a scribe in the Persian administration. So this is another case where, right, yeah. And this actually gave him access to a lot of the records that he then quotes in his books. Because it would be rare for anybody, normally to have access to the Persian records unless you were really somebody that was really working with them. So it's another case where God put somebody in the right spot at the right time to have what was needed. Another thing interesting to notice about the book of Ezra, in the first 6 chapters, he's talking in the third person, which is, he did this and he did that, et cetera, that. But now, when you get to chapter 7, he switches to first person and starts talking about I. This happens also coincide with, time-wise, with when Ezra led the second wave coming back. So the thought that I have, seen as I've been reading up on this is that the first 6 chapters he was doing like from his notes or his memoirs, because the first 6 chapters talks more about the first wave coming back, so it's like what he heard about it, etc. And then starting in chapter 7, when it's him leading the second wave back, now it's basically as it's happening, he's writing it. And then the government documents that he includes, they're actually key to allowing the work to proceed, despite the efforts of the neighboring peoples. Because the neighboring peoples are also under Persian rule. So these are all Persian documents giving whoever, whether it's Ezra or anybody else, permission to do what they're doing. That way, nobody can question it, because it's like, okay, the king says you can do this, so there's no way that anybody can question it. So that's kind of an interesting thing. And the other thing, in the original text for this, most of it's written in Hebrew, but the government documents are written in Aramaic, which at that time was like the language of all the business that was getting done. Just like, after the Greeks took over, everything was done in Greek. And even during the Roman times, Greek was still like the language of commerce. And then the Latin, from Rome was used just in the government part. So that's why, like when we see Paul, who was being a Roman citizen, raised Greek, and the Hebrew of Hebrews, he had it all covered. So he knew Hebrew, he knew Greek, and he knew Latin. So he had the whole thing covered. But it was interesting that Ezra put the documents in their original Aramaic. Probably, again, just anybody seeing this, that he wrote down, they're going to be able to at least read that part. Whether they know Hebrew or not, they're probably going to know Aramaic. Okay, Ezra, being a priest, one of the things he does is he helps establish the temple worship and the sacrificial system again once they get back and get things going again. Zerubbabel and then Joshua got things going. He comes back and is helping get it going too. And he also cleans up the priesthood. It turns out that, kind of like we've seen in the past, the priests aren't immune to the sins of the people. So a lot of them were doing the same things that the people were doing, because even during when they returned here, you got to remember they'd been living 70 years under Persian rule, basically in a Persian city. So they picked up a lot of the Persian habits. They get back here, and there's still some of them, they're not exactly doing what they should be according to the law. Which brings us to the next point that Ezra got to, is he was also working at turning the people away from the idol worship, and the other big problem that they had at that time, which was that they were marrying people from these surrounding communities, which had been then, all these people in the surrounding areas were people that had been imported either by Babylon or Persia, because that was one of the tactics of those empires at the time. When they conquered somebody, they'd move you out of your territory into one of the other areas that they conquered to defuse the situation a little bit, because if you're not in your own land, you're not as likely to want to rise up and try to take it back. So that was part of their strategy that they used. So you had all these people around there that were imported from somewhere else.
And they were all idol worshippers.
They were all idol worshippers.
So if you were a Jew,
Yeah.
and you mess with this girl, she was an idol worshiper, who takes you away from God.
Right. Yeah. Same problem they've had. Even back, during the time when we were looking at, the prophets. The problem that's been around a long time. Anyhow, he also, this is the time of the prophets Haggai and Zechariah, so they were around, giving their messages that we saw the last semester. So Ezra is working at the same time as these guys, so he's in the priest role, and then you got the prophets are off doing the prophet thing, so they worked in conjunction, basically coming up with the same kind of message, which was to give them some hope and to get them back on track, and give up the idol worships, and let's get back to the way it should be. And the other kind of interesting thing here is, do we maybe see some influence of Esther going on here? Maybe her influence on Artaxerxes, who was the king at the time?
Okay,
Because
Artaxerxes is the same guy as Xerxes, who's also what's the other name that he has?
Well, there was Cyrus.
No. I'm talking about
we had
Esther's husband, the king.
He was Artaxerxes, and I forget he had a couple of different names. Artaxerxes was his Persian name, and then
Right.
I don't really recall off the top of my head what other names that they used, but
Bob.
Yeah, okay, Bob, yeah. That would have been nice if those names would
Yeah.
have been Bob, John, and Sam.
yeah, actually Xerxes was a different one. Then there's Artaxerxes. So
Okay, I'm sorry, but Artaxerxes she was his queen, right?
right, yeah, but it's right during this period between the first return and the second return is the time frame of the book of Esther, when all that's going on. And if you look in verse 622 of Ezra, it says, that the Lord had turned the heart of the king of Assyria. Now, the term king of Assyria, that's, Assyria had been the big rule, then Babylon, but basically all the ones that conquered up through Persia kept that same title, king of Assyria, all through it. So don't get confused there. But as I said, the Lord had turned the heart of the king of Assyria to encourage them. And it makes you think this was Artaxerxes. So, but you think, what would possibly turn the heart of the king to be favorable to the Hebrews?
Well, it was Esther.
Esther. Mm-hmm.
Because of Mordecai and
yeah.
And the other.
So it's kind of neat to see how this whole thing fits in. So this, if you want to look at it, Esther kind of fits in between chapters 6 and 7 of the book of Ezra. If you're looking at it, on the timeline or where it might fit. Now we'll get into our friend Nehemiah. Okay, so this basically is just a continuation of where Ezra, the book of Ezra, leads off. It was written by Ezra. Now, Nehemiah was the cupbearer for King Artaxerxes. So, you might think, oh, well, gee, what's a cupbearer? A lot of people think just a slave that just brings the wine. Well, really, it was kind of a high position. It was more than just somebody that brings this wine and actually has to taste it to make sure that it's not poisoned. But the cupbearers become more of a, confidant and even a bit of an advisor. So they actually had a pretty good relationship. As you can see that as this story develops. But it was a fairly high post, And so here's another case of where we've got, a Hebrew that has risen to a high position in the conquering government. And then is in the position to use that to help out, the people of Israel and to get God's plan done. So you've got, like Daniel rose to the, the high point.
Joseph.
Joseph way back when did that. But just in this one though, you've got, Daniel was, big in both Babylon and the Persian Empire. Zerubbabel actually, they don't say exactly what he did, but because he had also a Persian name, they figure he was somewhat of a government official of some kind, because he was also sent back, to be the governor. So with both a Hebrew and a Persian name, it's obviously he was a Hebrew in some good standing with the Persian government. Now you've got, Ezra was a scribe in that same government, and now Nehemiah was the cupbearer of the king. So kind of see what God's doing here. He's got all these guys just in the right spot at the right time. And the other thing that's kind of interesting here is they talk about, especially with Nehemiah, one of the big focuses is the rebuilding of the wall around Jerusalem. And the fact they got it done in 52 days, that's quite a task in itself. But an even bigger deal is the fact that they were allowed to rebuild it in the first place. Because you think about this, here's a conquered people going back to their land, essentially being allowed to rebuild their defenses. Because these walls around these cities were the prime defense in any military situation. And that took a lot of confidence by Artaxerxes in the people that he'd appointed there. That they weren't going to just turn around and suddenly try to do something against him once they got those walls back up. So that showed that, the close relationship that there really was between Nehemiah and King Artaxerxes to allow that to happen. And that's why, of course, you see all the people that are in the surrounding areas being so upset, because now they can't easily come and pester Jerusalem because it's got the walls rebuilt again. So they're fairly secure now with those walls back up. So that kind of torqued off the neighbors. But that, it's really just a big thing that was allowed to happen, because it just is, conquering nations generally don't allow the people they conquered to rebuild their defenses. And that's essentially what was happening here.
If I remember reading correctly, the king had them go back and look at what was written from the kings prior, right? To make sure that
Right.
The prophecy,
they
like,
give them the okay to go ahead and rebuild
Right.
the wall.
Yeah, some of the neighbors were complaining, and then they went back and found the records that Cyrus had said, yeah, it's okay to go back. And so he said, okay, keep going. Keep doing your thing. Again, that might also be tied to what we were looking at in one of the previous sessions, where the way the Persian law is written, once the king says it, it can't be changed.
right. Yeah, like in Esther.
Mm-hmm. So that's kind of an interesting spot there, but that's actually bigger than you might think when they just talk about building the walls. But it's really a big thing, and not something that you really see going on in those times.
And the fact that they would at least honor what
Mm-hmm.
Cyrus had commanded.
Right. So then we continue on with our friend Nehemiah here. This is all about renewal and revival, this whole book. They complete the establishment of the proper temple worship and sacrifice. You had to make sure that was going on right. One of the first things you've got to get established when you're trying to get going back is to get your institutions working. And, for the Hebrews, what's one of the most important things? Temple worship. And they got to get it going, and they got to get it going right. And that's why there was all this thing about cleansing the priesthood, because they were off doing the same things that the people were doing. They had wives that were from other surrounding groups and doing things they shouldn't have, so they had to take care of that first, get that straightened out, so that then, they could help the people with their revival. And they continued on with this work, about eliminating the marriages in between the Jews and the surrounding people that, down in among the people. So they had a whole range of things going on there. One interesting thing I read about was that you might see a little bit of a change here, because technically the letter of the law would say you're supposed to stone them, but I think you'd probably end up taking out everybody. So they made a little bit of a change to the way that they handled it. They just had to I think they called it put them away, which is essentially like, they live, you got an apartment for them over here, but you don't have anything to do with them, type thing.
Like shunning.
Yeah, I guess that's one way, maybe. And then at the end of Nehemiah, you find out that they've now essentially, taken a covenant and an oath to say, okay, yes, we will follow the ways that we're supposed to do. We'll follow the laws. We'll live according to the law. So they've reestablished that again now, finally. Yeah, another time and yet again. So we saw this whole cycle just kind of keeps going. They get it right for a while, then they get not so right. And then they get it right for a while, and then they fall away. It's, that whole sequence we saw, when we were looking at the prophets, is still going on. The other thing that's kind of interesting we find out here is we kind of see the rise of the chief priest to a bit of a more political position, more so than being strictly religious. Part of this might be due to the fact that, of course, that you don't have, a Davidic king sitting and ruling, because they're still under the foreign rule, whether it was Babylon, Persia, Greece, or Rome. So the chief priests are taking a little bit more of a political role now. The first governors, as we saw, like with Zerubbabel and Nehemiah, these actually were Hebrews, but as you go through this progression, from Babylon to Persia to Greece to Rome, they kind of lose the governorships that get appointed by all these people, kind of lose their connection to the Hebrews. They might be, from someplace around, Herod the Great was what, an Idumean, which was basically an enemy at the time. So they might be from the area, but they're not necessarily that likable to the Hebrews. Maybe don't have the Hebrews' best interest either as time progresses. So the priests are now becoming a little bit more political, and that trend keeps building and building and building until we see, the high priest office during the time of Jesus. That was a lot of political power that chief priest had. And they're also, of course, worried a lot more about, what the Romans were thinking. So we can kind of see how that evolved, and it kind of starts here. Start seeing it where it's beginning, and then, over because this is also kind of coinciding with the prophet Malachi. Right after this is when things go silent for 400 years. We don't hear anything, no prophets, no nothing, until we start off, and then you get, John the Baptist and then Jesus. So that's kind of the interesting part there, I think.
So we skip over the whole Grecian control over the area? We go right to Rome?
Well, it's during that, what they call the intertestamental period. And so after the Persians come the Greeks. But there was nothing being written at the time from, the Hebrew, the canonical books. That's where you get like into the Maccabees, that sort of thing. So that's why, even though the books of Maccabee are not included in the canon, they are interesting to look at as far as history, because those are the stuff that was written during the time of the Greeks. And then once Rome conquered Greece, now you've got then the Romans start taking over the area. So the final thing I want to get to here is a little bit of a group discussion. So in the last 4 books, we've looked at 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and then we see the promise to return. Darn frogs. Yeah, so we see the promise to return the people to the land. And we see how it was kept. So that basically shows us that God is a promise keeper. He keeps his promises. It's part of the whole theme of this whole thing is all these books are trying to show these people that have come back now that see, God promised 70 years you'd be in exile. 70 years are gone. He kept his promise. You're coming back. So basically, what I kind of like to just have you guys toss out ideas and maybe get into a little discussion about is what stands out to you about how God was controlling the action during this time, using both Jews and the non-Jews to accomplish his purpose. I mean, he used Babylon. He used Persia, who were definitely not followers of Yahweh, but he used them to accomplish his goals. We see how he put people into the positions. So what do you guys see that? And do you see anything like this today? How does this apply to the promises that are yet to be fulfilled? And how does that affect the way that you act, what you do, and then actually how you minister? So let's just open it up and see if anybody has any thoughts on that. And hopefully, if you're a little further away, just speak up a little extra. Hopefully this mic will pick it up for our people that are online to kind of hear what was going on a little bit.
Well, one thing that comes to mind is both the second and the third question is, God calls us to be, set apart, to be holy, and that, He uses both Christians and non-Christians alike to accomplish as well. And what stands out to me is that a lot of the Jews that were really committed to God were very trustworthy individuals that were able to get into areas that have influence over non-Christians, ruled, and through both, being able to get their confidence and develop the trust with those, they were able to be used, by God in a very strategic way at that period of time. But had they not been set apart, they were respected, even though they may have different views, but they were respected for what they stood for. And so in today's life, we too have to minister to everybody, and we have to be set apart, even though we're working in a very non-Christian environment.
Yeah, that's a good point there, because like you said, these people that got into these positions did it because they were trustworthy. You know, if you're going to be a cupbearer for the king, you got to be pretty trustworthy, because you're bringing him that, and you've got a chance there, if you were not the most scrupulous, to do something really nasty. And that trust was then reflected in that relationship between Artaxerxes and Nehemiah.
God is orchestrating so many things to solve what seems to be our inherent or our condition that we all live with is sin. So he has been orchestrating things together and working prophecy together to continually try and wrap us into try to grow us into a relationship with him. Just seeing how, like I said, civilizations come and fall, and it's all comes down to, strip it all away, it's all about the sin, the problem that separates us from God. God is so committed to building a relationship with us that he, like I said, puts things in motion that take hundreds of thousands of years, but it's all a process of love to try and reconcile us to him. It's amazing to kind of see it unfolding, and all the pieces of the puzzle start to kind of come together that began from creation.
Right. Yeah, because it was way back then that sin entered, so.
Well, it says before the
Yeah.
foundations of the world, God had us in mind.
Right.
He settled on us as the object of his love. He put this plan in motion before we even knew it. And it's crazy, but it comes down to strip it away. You strip away the little civilizations, you call it different things, you call it Greece, you call it Rome. It all comes down to the problem of sin. It all comes down to why do I need this? It's because I have a disease that's called sin that separates me from God. And so strip all of that away, it's just God trying to reconcile us to himself. Just see it tough to swallow, it's just to think about it. Because mind to just comprehend that is blows me
Right.
away.
And I think what do you see, like, today, like you say, it's a triple. You take away, Greece or Rome, now, what are the, opposing factors now, that are happening, so that, it's kind of making us look at ourselves and how we react, and what happened, after 9/11, when suddenly a lot of people started going back to church. So yeah, that sort of thing. It's really interesting how, we see this pattern, and he's persistent. Very, very fortunately, he's persistent. He just keeps following this same pattern, where, okay, if you guys aren't going to do it, then I'll get somebody that will. It may not be somebody you would expect. Who would expect, Babylon would be part of his plan? But he used that
I was just thinking about
to do the
Paul,
punishment.
about Paul, um, you know, in his letter to the Romans, how, you know, God used Paul, who was basically a Christian slayer, Christian killer, turned him around.
Yeah.
And, you know, and in the book of Romans, he's telling, you know, tells us about how the gospel is for everybody. So he used, like you say, Paul that had three places, three I guess you would call badges of honor or whatever. Started out as somebody who hated God, who loved God, and who was able to bring that message to people other than the Jews.
Right. Yeah, another case of, taking advantage of the local ruling because, the fact that he was a Roman citizen got him out of a lot of situations and got him into other situations that he normally couldn't get in. And then because of, his mission trips, a lot of that was because of the infrastructure that Rome had put in place. The Roman roads and, the Pax Romana, which was, the peace of Rome at the time. There wasn't a whole lot of turmoil going on in the world just because Rome wouldn't allow it. But it made it real safe for him to travel. So another case of, using a society that is, very unlikely to make sure that his goals are taken care of. Anybody else see anything that as they're looking at this?
Well, I think just, we talked about today, it says, the Bible says, in all things are held together by him. You talk about his purpose. All things are held together by God. He is the reason, he is the purpose behind everything that we have. So the purpose of the plan that he's orchestrating, things like that, it should give us a confidence in knowing that the Lord is at work always, and obviously promises. It's just, that he is in control of all things.
Right.
Like I said, civilizations, things are just our issue.
Yeah, and I think that's really a lot. One of the main points of these books is here these people have come back, and they're trying to give them the confidence to say, yes, look how God has done this. He is true to his word, and so these promises that are yet to be fulfilled, you can have confidence that he's going to keep them. You pretty much just nailed the the main theme of these books right there.
Well, it's the same thing with the academic.
Yeah.
Same thing we try to do with ministry.
Any other thoughts on this? Or?
Just a small one, because I think it affects this group here, is that, if we look around in person, everybody has a certain strength, and yet, we don't feel really that what we do. We really know just how little that we do know about God's word. And so as we, how to minister, it's amazing to be able to sit here and know that a year ago, a lot of us were not sure exactly how our views could have been. We had a certain confidence level, but to know that, again, God's controlling everything, and we're just simply standing in the gap where he's going to use whatever talent we have, because it's not us.
Right.
It's him working through us, and all he asks us to do is just be available. Sometimes kind of weak gifts and you're not really feeling adequate, and that could be that spot. That's what you got to feel accomplished great things.
Yeah. And people see, they go, well, how'd they ever be able to do that? And that's because, and that then says, well, it's got to be God allowing that to happen. In fact, the phrase I've been seeing a lot lately is, God doesn't call the equipped, he equips the called. So like you say, being willing to be there is one of the big things. You know, as Pastor Rick often says, you know, the most dangerous prayer you can pray is, God, use me.
Yeah. And don't tell him how to use you because don't tell him what you don't want to do.
Yeah,
Guess what
yeah,
you're gonna do.
yeah, because whatever you say you don't want to do is what you're probably going to end up doing. And reverse psychology doesn't work. Don't say, "Oh, I really don't want to work in a really neat area like Tahiti or something." Thinking he's going to send you there. No, you probably end up in North Pole. Okay, well, I guess that's it for this one. I think we had a good discussion here. I hope the people online get a sense of what's going on here, and maybe they'll kind of mentally enter into the discussion themselves. Or if they really come up with something that they saw, hopefully they'll email and we can bring that in the next week. We can report on what we may have heard from them. So I guess we'll take a break now and be ready for Paul to come up with his part.